we heard yesterday from Dr. Anthony Fauci that the National Institutes of Health, they're seeing positive signs and some early testing of a drug that could shorten the hospital stay of those who are battling the coronavirus. What can you tell us about that?
So it's called remdesivir. Gilead is the manufacturer. This was a study conducted of COVID-19 patients in a hospital setting, meaning they're already in pretty serious shape, and it's a therapeutic drug. It's not a vaccine, but it treats the underlying symptoms. And it was discovered in this clinical testing and trial that those patients who received remdesivir were able to be discharged from the hospital in a healthy situation more rapidly than those who did not, who were in the placebo group. And that, Dr. Fauci said in the Oval Office sitting right next to President Trump yesterday, is a very positive sign that this is a therapeutic drug that can be effective and therefore should be more rapidly introduced as a therapeutic treatment. And the Federal Food and Drug Administration, rather, is considering an emergency announcement, a regulatory move to make that a possible therapeutic drug for COVID-19 patients. And Dr. Fauci, who has a tremendous amount of experience in how these things evolve and how therapeutics build on one another, said very clearly this is not the only answer, but it is a significant toward therapies for certain kinds of COVID-19 patients.
Meanwhile, Major, the Trump administration is launching a project called Operation Warp Speed to spur the development of a coronavirus vaccine. What should our audience know?
So, originally reported by the New York Times, backed up by reporting from CBS, Bloomberg, and others. Catchy name, but that doesn't mean you should ignore it. Operation Warp Speed is essentially the federal government telling all laboratories working on vaccines to work as rapidly as you can, and importantly, that the federal government will backstop that work with federal taxpayer dollars, which means those companies that are investing enormous sums in the pursuit of a vaccine can do some federal money to support that work. The goal, hundreds of millions of vaccines as early as January 2021. And this morning on the Today Show, another network, but we must acknowledge it, Dr. Anthony Fauci was asked, is that possible? He said, I believe it is. That's no guarantee, but it is clearly an administration effort to bring as many different drug companies who are involved in this work together to work as fast as they can on development of the vaccine, the testing of the vaccine, and all the things that need into it, develop it, test it, manufacture it, have it available after you've manufactured it in sufficient doses and distributed. All of that is an enormous change, which is why it takes oftentimes 12 months to 18 months to work this out, to do that as rapidly as humanly and scientifically possible. The one note of caution here is that is a goal, and that there is federal taxpayer dollars behind it can expedite it. But you can't hurry those benchmarks. It has to work. It has to be able to be produced on mass scale. It has to be distributed on a mass scale basis. All those things have yet to be achieved. So it is a goal, and we should view it as such, but that's the push from the administration.
So meanwhile, Major, we're hearing that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is pushing China to get access to its virology labs. Oh, I said that right, in Wuhan, right? What is behind this push right now?
There are two elements to it. One is scientific and information and transparency. One is political. Let's take the first one, scientific information transparency. Look, you don't need to be a China hawk, meaning someone who for a long time has wondered about whether the United States' relationship with China is too one-sided, to see that the Chinese government, through the Communist Party, did not inform the world as rapidly as it should have and disclose nearly as much as it knew in December, January about COVID-19. That's just a fact, and all that has to be legitimately investigated. There's also this underlying question of this virology lab, and there's not just one in China, might have been testing things related to coronaviruses. There's nothing scandalous about that. according to the scientists and medical experts I've talked to for my show, Debriefing the Briefing, and my other podcast, The Takeout. I've had a lot of conversations about that. There's nothing scandalous about China having virology labs studying viruses because many of them emanate from Asia, avian and otherwise. SARS is a classic example. So studying that is not a scandal. But could there have been something in a lab that was zoonotic, meaning animal-born, that was being studied, and somehow through an accident that should be looked into? And for a long time now, the administration has asked China to allow U.S. medical experts with CDC and other organizations into China to see what can be learned. And the Chinese, through the Communist Party, has resisted that. That's all on the scientific transparency information side. What's the political side of it? Donald Trump, as I well remember in 2016, because I was at almost every single rally and traveled with him all around the country covering that campaign, made China and the United States' relationship with China a very big part of his campaign. And his supporters care about that issue dramatically. And his supporters are far more willing to blame China for whatever lack of rapid response the United States was able to marshal January, February, and March to COVID-19 than blame the president or his China. So the political impact of that is to say China's the problem, not President Trump. And if China had been more forthcoming and transparent, President Trump could have done some things more aggressively. Trump supporters largely fall into that category. So this is a way of communicating to them that the real problem here is not any missteps of the administration, the White House president, or anyone else on the task force. It was China. That's the political side of this equation.
Yeah, and Major, as you know, the Trump administration and his campaign is seeking to tie Joe Biden to China when, in fact, the president of the United States, his family, long before he ascended to the presidency, had significant business dealings in China. That's a whole other conversation. But staying on the subject of Joe Biden, his presumptive opponent, the president's presumptive opponent, so he is facing a sexual assault allegation from a former aide in his Senate office. Now, his campaign has denied the allegations, but how is the accusation impacting his campaign? There are calls now by the Washington Post, editorial board, and others for the vice president, the former vice president, to address this head on. What are you hearing?
Right. This has been a key week. This story has really turned this week. And for a lot of reasons, COVID-19 coverage dominated all of the news inquiries from all the major news organizations. There are plenty of conservatives who believe the mass media, the mainstream media, didn't want to touch this story. But it was a crucial week this week in the sense that many people who have recently endorsed Joe Biden, prominent, visible female Democrats, have been asked about this case. Briefly, Tara Reid is the accuser's name. 1993, worked for Joe Biden, said at that time, her initial comment some time ago was there was an incident. Then it became an assault, penetration of the fingers, something really terrible, sounds awful. There has been some people that she knew who she did not originally point to who have corroborated conversations with her at the time about something bad happening involving her and Senator Biden. This has led the Washington Post editorial board, as you said, Vlad, to say this is a serious issue. There are some elements of this story that don't all line up, but one thing that can be done, and the Washington Post editorial board said should be done, is that there is this repository of records that Senator Biden has in Delaware. Maybe there is something in there about a personnel complaint of this kind that might suggest there was something at least filed about this. It might help the public understand whether or not there was any paperwork at the time. People who worked in Joe Biden's office a long time ago in the Senate said they have no recollection of any incident like this whatsoever. Maybe there's a piece of paper or some kind of complaint file. At minimum, the Washington Post editorial board said that's something that the vice president, as the presumptive Democratic nominee, ought to be willing to share and have at least an exploratory process through those documents to see what's there or what isn't there. So this story this week has gained traction. Vice President Biden has not addressed it personally. His campaign has. Just this morning, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi was asked if that was good enough for her. She said it was. Stacey Abrams has weighed in on it this week. Amy Klobuchar has. Kristen Gillibrand has. And in the whole atmosphere of the Me Too movement, how seriously Democrats take Tara Reade's accusation, how willing they are to press the vice president to address it publicly, became a much bigger, much more visible issue this week than it had any previous week. And that's where we are.
But Major, I got to ask, you mentioned Senator Gillibrand. I remember what happened to Senator Al Franken. I guess the question I have for you, do Democrats risk being seen as hypocritical for those folks who have now come out in support of Joe Biden, those folks like former President Barack Obama, like Secretary Hillary Clinton, who are endorsing Joe Biden, but who had a lot to say around, for example, Brett Kavanaugh, Justice Kavanaugh, and Al Franken, and even the President of the United States when that Access Hollywood tape came out. Do they run the risk of being accused of being hypocrites because they have made the Me Too movement a significant part, Democrats have, of their platforms?
It is a significant and very real risk, because if you say that these accusations must be aired, as they all have, they said terror should be listened to, should be heard, and then you dismiss them or act as if you dismiss them or give the impression that a 1 or 2 sentence statement from the Biden campaign is all that's required, then are you really giving them significant weight? And are you really asking for the kind of investigatory pursuit that you asked of Brett Kavanaugh, and that you've justifiably, from your point of view and with great rhetorical vigor, demanded of everyone else accused in these types of situations? That equivalence has to exist. It has to exist as a matter of justice. It also has to exist as a matter of taking this universally seriously. And it also has to exist as a matter of political consistency. And you can't say, or you can't leave the impression, yeah, Me Too is really important, except when it's our person involved and the stakes are so high because we really like him and we think he's a great person, whoever the former Vice President Biden. All of those things are there. And there's another dimension to this, too, in which Trump supporters and Republicans generally look at the Brett Kavanaugh situation and say, wait, all of this intensity, all of this righteous anger about Brett Kavanaugh, when from their perspective, the evidentiary pattern behind those accusations doesn't look to them, at least as initially sufficient as it does in the Tara Reade case, then they say that's a media problem, that's a hypocrisy problem, that's a political favoritism issue. All of those things brew very, very effectively within the Trump world to say, see, all the things are stacked against us in this culture, and that's why supporting Donald Trump, that's why reelecting him is so important. That being said, all the things I've just said, you have to also understand and remember that it's not just the Access Hollywood tape. There are plenty of allegations against Donald Trump that were raised in 2016, have been raised since, of serious assaultive or dismissive or flagrantly offensive behavior that he is also more or less summarily dismissed. And his supporters, because I've done this person to person with them, will say, well, he's a flawed person, but he's still a great person. So they have their own explanations that don't always align with a righteous sense of indignation either. So we can't let that go unsaid.
Very complete description of where we are right now, Major. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you.